Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing in Book 2 from The New Science of Giambattista Vico. We are on Chapter 5, this entitled Corollaries Concerning the Origins of Poetic Style, Episode, Inversion, Rhythm, Song, and Verse. And with that said, I'll get started with paragraph 456. In this way, the nations formed the poetic language, composed of divine and heroic characters, later expressed in vulgar speech, and finally written in vulgar characters. It was born entirely of poverty of language and need of expression. This proved by the first lights of poetic style, which are vivid representations, images, similes, circumlocutions, phrases explaining things by their natural properties, descriptions gathered from their minuter or their more sensible effects, and finally their striking and even their trifling collateral circumstances. 457. Episodes were born of the grossness of the heroic minds, unable to confine themselves to those essential features of things that were to the purpose in hand, as we see to be the natural case with the feeble-minded and above all with women. 458. Inversions arose from the difficulty of completing statements with their verbs, which, as we have seen, were the last part of speech to be invented. Thus the Greeks, who were more ingenious, used fewer inversions than the Latins, and the Latins fewer than the Germans. 459. Prose rhythm was understood late by the writers, in Greek by Gorgias of Leontini, and in Latin by Cicero, because earlier, according to Cicero himself, they had given a rhythmic character to their orations by using certain poetic measures. This fact will presently be very useful when we discuss the origins of song and verse. 460. From all this, it appears to have been demonstrated that, by a necessity of human nature, poetic style arose before prose style, just as by the same necessity, the fables or imaginative universals arose before the rational or philosophic universals, which were formed through the medium of prose speech. For after the poets had formed poetic speech by associating particular ideas, as we have fully shown, the peoples went on to form prose speech by contracting into single words, as into the genus, the parts which poetic speech had associated. Take, for example, the poetic phrase, "The blood boils in my heart," based on a property natural, eternal, and common to all mankind. They took the blood, the boiling, and the heart, and made of them a single word, as it were a genus, called in Greek stomachos, in Latin ira, and in Italian cholera. Following the same pattern, hieroglyphics and heroic letters were reduced to a few vulgar letters, as genera assimilating innumerable diverse articulate sounds, a feat requiring consummate genius. By means of these vulgar genera, both of words and of letters, the minds of the peoples grew quicker and developed powers of abstraction, and the way was thus prepared for the coming of philosophers, who formed intelligible genera. What has here been discussed is a small portion of the history of ideas. To such an extent has it been necessary, in seeking the origins of letters, to deal in the same breath with those languages. 461. Concerning song and verse, we have proposed the axiom that since men are shown to have been originally mute, they must have uttered vowel sounds by singing, as mutes do. And later, like stammerers, they must have uttered articulate consonantal sounds, still by singing. This first singing of the peoples has left a great testimony in the diphthong surviving in the languages. These must originally have been more numerous, as the Greeks and the French, who passed prematurely from the poetic to the vulgar age, have left us a great many of them, as observed in the axioms. The reason for this is that the vowels are easy to form, and the consonants difficult, and, as has been shown, the first dull-witted men were moved to utterance only by very violent passions, which are naturally expressed in a very loud voice. And nature brings it about that when man greatly raises his voice, he breaks into diphthongs and song, as noted in the axioms. Thus, as shown a little above, the first Greeks, in the time of their gods, formed the first spondaic heroic verse with the diphthong pai, employing twice as many vowels as consonants. 462. Again, this first song of the peoples sprang naturally from the difficulty of the first utterances, which can be demonstrated both from cause and from effect. From cause, since in these men the fibers of their organ for articulating sounds were quite hard, and there were very few sounds they could make. As on the other hand, children with very flexible fibers, born into our pleasant plenty of words, are observed to pronounce consonants only with the greatest difficulty, as remarked in the axioms. And the Chinese, whose vulgar language has no more than 300 articulated words, which, with various modifications of pitch and tempo, correspond to their 120,000 hieroglyphs, also speak by singing. And from the effect by the contraction of words, of which innumerable examples are observed in Italian poetry, in our Origins of the Latin Language we set forth a great number, which must have begun short and have been lengthened in the course of time. And on the other hand, by redundancies, because stutterers use a syllable which they can more readily utter singing, in such a way as to compensate for those they find it difficult to pronounce, as set forth in the axioms. Thus there was among us in my time an excellent tenor with this speech defect, who, when he stumbled over a word, would break into the sweetest song, and so pronounce it. Certainly the Arabs begin almost all their words with al, and it is said the Huns were so called because they begin all theirs with hun. Finally, that languages began with song is shown by what we have said, that prior to Gorgias and Cicero, the Greek and Latin prose writers used certain almost poetic rhythms, as in the returned barbarian times the fathers of the Roman Church did, and it will be found those of the Greek Church did too, so that their prose seems made for chanting. 463. The first verse must have sprung up, as we have recently shown it did, conformably to the language and time of the heroes. That is, it was heroic verse, the grandest of all, and the proper verse for heroic poetry, and it was born of the most violent passions of fear and joy, for heroic poetry has to do only with the extremely perturbed passions. However, its spondaic origin was not from the great fear of the python, as vulgar tradition relates, for such perturbation rather quickens ideas and words than retards them, whence in Latin festinens and solicitus connote fear. No, it was because of the slowness of mind and stiffness of tongue of the founders of nations that heroic verse was born spondaic, as we have shown, and from that origin it retains the characteristic of never admitting anything but a spondee on the last foot. Later, as minds and tongues became quicker, the dactyl was introduced. Then, as both became still more practiced, there arose the iamb, the quote-unquote quick foot, as Horace calls it. Two axioms have been set forth with regard to these origins. Finally, when mind and tongue had reached the highest degree of celerity, there developed prose, which, as we recently saw, speaks as it were in intelligible genre. Iambic verse comes so near to prose that prose writers have often fallen into it inadvertently. Thus song went on growing swifter in its verse forms, in proportion as ideas and tongues became quicker among the nations, as we have also noted in the axioms. 464. This philosophy is confirmed by history, which tells us of nothing more ancient than oracles and sibyls, as set forth in the axioms. Thus, to signify that a thing was very old, there was the saying, "That is older than the sibyl." And the sibyls, of whom a good dozen have come down to us, were scattered among all the nations. There is a vulgar tradition to the effect that the Sibyls sing in heroic verse, and the oracles of all nations also gave their responses in heroic verse. For that reason, the Greeks called this Pythian from their famous oracle of Pythian Apollo, who must have been so called from his slaying of the serpent called Python, which, in the account related above, gave rise to the first spondaic verse. By the Latins, heroic verse was called Saturnian, as Festus attests. It must have sprung up in Italy in the age of Saturn, which corresponds to the golden age of the Greeks, in which Apollo, like the other gods, had dealings on earth with men. And Ennius, again according to Festus, says that in this verse the fauns of Italy delivered their prophecies, or oracles, which certainly among the Greeks, as we have said, were delivered in hexameters. But later in the term, Saturnian verses was applied to iambic sonari, perhaps because by then it was as natural to speak in these Saturnian iambic verses as it had previously been to speak in Saturnian heroic verses. 465. Hebraists today are divided in their opinions upon the question whether Hebrew poetry is metrical or merely rhythmical. However, Josephus, Philo, Origen, and Eusebius stand as favoring meter. And, what is most to our present purpose, St. Jerome holds that the Book of Job, which is older than the books of Moses, was composed in heroic verse from the beginning of the 3rd chapter to the end of the 42nd. 466. The Arabs, ignorant of letters, as related by the anonymous author Thomas Baker, of a book on the uncertainty of the sciences, preserved their language by memorizing their poems until they overran the eastern provinces of the Greek Empire. 467. The Egyptians inscribed memorials of their dead in verse on columns called syringes, from seer, which means song, whence the name of the siren, a deity beyond doubt celebrated for her singing. Ovid says the nymph Syrinx was equally celebrated for beauty and for song. By the same token, the Syrians and Assyrians, whose names are likewise derived from Syr, must have spoken at first in verse. 468. Certainly the founders of Greek humanity were the theological poets, and these were heroes and sang in heroic verse. 469. We have seen that the first authors of the Latin language were the Salii, who were sacred poets, from whom we have the fragments of the Salian verses, which have an air of heroic verse and are the oldest memorials of Latin speech. The conquering ancient Romans left memorials of their triumphs in a sort of heroic verse. Like the, quote, by a great duel by subduing kings, end quote, of Lucius Aemilius Regulus, and the, quote, he overthrows, puts to flight, and overthrows the greatest legions, end quote, of Acilius Glabrio, and others. In the fragments of the Law of the 12 Tables, the articles seem upon careful reflection to end for the most part in Adonic verses, which are the concluding portions of the heroic verses. Cicero must have imitated them in his Laws, which begin thus, quote, by approaching the gods chastely, by employing piety, end quote. Whence the Roman custom, also mentioned by Cicero, whereby the children learned the Law of the 12 Tables by singing it, quote, as if a necessary poem, end quote, as an indispensable song, to use his words. The Cretan children, we are told by Aelian, did likewise with the laws of their country. Certainly Cicero, famous as the discoverer of the prose rhythm among the Latins, as Gorgias of Leontini had been among the Greeks, a point reflected upon above, must have shunned in his prose of such weighty argument, not merely verses so sonorous, but iambic verse as well, much as the latter resembles prose, and he guarded himself against it even in his familiar correspondence. Hence, the vulgar traditions concerning this kind of verse must be true. The first, according to Plato, that the laws of the Egyptians were poems of the goddess Isis. The second, according to Plutarch, Lycurgus gave his laws to the Spartans in verse, forbidding them in one particular law to acquire knowledge of letters. The third, according to Maximus of Tyre, that Jove had given the laws of Minos in verse. The fourth and last, cited by Suidas, that Draco, who by another vulgar tradition wrote his laws in blood, proclaimed them to the Athenians in verse. 470. We return now from laws to history. Tacitus, in his account of the customs of the ancient Germans, relates that they preserved in verse the beginnings of their history, and Lipsius, in his notes on the passage, says the same of the American Indians. The example of the two nations, of which the first was known only to the Romans, and to them very late, and the second discovered but 2 centuries ago by our Europeans, gives us a strong argument for conjecturing the same of all other barbarous nations, both ancient and modern. And conjecture aside, the authorities tell us that the Persians among the ancient nations, and the Chinese among those discovered in modern times, wrote their first histories in verse. And here let this important observation be made, that if the peoples were established by laws, and if among all these peoples the laws were given in verse, and if the first things of these peoples were likewise preserved in verse, it necessarily follows that all the first peoples were poets. 471. We resume now the subject under discussion concerning the origins of verse. According to Festus, the wars with Carthage were described in heroic verse by Naevius, even before Ennius's time. And Livius Andronicus, the first Latin writer, wrote the Romanidae, a heroic poem containing the annals of the ancient Romans. And the returned barbarian times, the Latin historians were heroic poets, like Gunther, William of Apulia, and others. We have seen that the first writers in the modern languages of Europe were versifiers, and in Silesia, a province almost entirely inhabited by peasants, the people are born poets. And generally, the German language preserves its heroic origins intact, even to excess, and this is the reason, though Adam Rechtenberg is unaware of it, for the fact he attests that Greek compound words can be happily rendered in German, especially in poetry. Bernegger compiled a catalogue of these words, and George Christoph Peisker has since been at pains to extend it in his index, quote, for the analogy of Greek and Germanic languages, end quote. The ancient Latin language has also left us many examples of compounds formed by combining whole words. And of these compounds, as of their right, the poets have continued to make use. For it must have been a common property of all the first languages that, as has been shown, they were furnished first with nouns, and only later with verbs. And so they had supplied the lack of verbs by putting nouns together. These must be the informing principles of what G. D. Morhofen has written in his, quote, Lessons in German Language and Poetry, end quote. Let this stand as a proof of the opinion which we stated in the Axioms, that, quote, if the scholars of the German language apply themselves to seeking its origins by these principles, they will make marvelous discoveries, end quote. 472. All that has here been reasoned out seems clearly to confute the common error of the grammarians, who say that prose speech came first, and speech in verse afterward. And within the origins of poetry, as they have here been disclosed, we have found the origins of language and letters. Chapter 6. The other corollaries announced at the beginning of Chapter 4. 473. Along with this first birth of characters and languages was also born law, which the Latins called ius, and the ancient Greeks dialon, which we explained above, as derived from dios and meaning celestial. Thence came the Latin phrase sub dio and sub iuv, both meaning under the sky. Later, as Plato says in the Cratylus, by refinement of speech, diaion became dikaion. For the heavens were observed as the aspect of Jove by all the Gentile nations and the world over, to receive therefrom their laws and the auspices which they considered to be his divine admonishments or commands. And this shows that all the nations were born in the persuasion of divine providence. 474. To enumerate: 1. For the Chaldeans the sky was Jove, in that they believed that they could foretell the future by the aspects and movements of the stars. The two sciences of these matters were called astronomy and astrology, the former dealing with the laws of the stars, and the latter, in the restricted sense of judicial astrology, with their language. In the Roman laws, judicial astrologers were still called Chaldeans. 475. 2. For the Persians, too, the sky was Jove, for it signified for them things hidden from men. Those who were learned in the science of these things were called mages, and the word magic was applied to two sciences. One, the legitimate natural science of the marvelous hidden forces of nature, the other, the illicit science of the supernatural. In the latter sense, a mage is a wizard. The mages used the rod, the lituus of the Roman augurs, to describe the circles of the astronomers. Later, the wizards made use of the rod and circles in their witchcraft. For the Persians, the sky was the temple of Jove, and Cyrus, because this was his religion, destroyed the temples built by the Greeks. 476. 3. For the Egyptians, too, Jove was the sky, for they believed that the heavens influenced sublunar affairs and announced future events. Hence, they believed they could direct celestial influences by casting their images at the right time, and this today they have preserved a vulgar art of divination. 477. 4. To the Greeks, Jove was likewise the sky, for they considered as of celestial origin the theorems and mathemata we have mentioned elsewhere. These they believed to be divine or sublime things to be contemplated by the bodily eyes and to be observed in the same sense of obeyed as laws of Jove. From mathemata comes the term mathematicians, as applied in the Roman laws to the judicial astrologers. 478. 5. As for the Romans, the verse of Ennius quoted above is well known. Quote, "Look at the sublime falling, whom all invoke as Jupiter." The pronoun this should here be taken, as we have said, as standing for heaven. The Romans also used the phrase temples of heaven, as we have said, for the regions of the sky marked out by the augurs for taking the auspices. Thus, the Latin templum came to signify any place which is free on every side and has an unobstructed prospect. Hence, exemplo meaning immediately. It is with this old sense in mind that Virgil calls the sea Neptunia Templa, or Neptunian temples. 479. 6. The ancient Germans, as Tacitus narrates, worshipped their gods in holy places, which he calls lights and trees. These must have been clearings leveled in the midst of the forest. The Church had great trouble in weaning them from this practice, as we gather from the councils of Nantes and Braga and Buchard's collection Decreta, and even today traces remain of it in Lapland and Livonia. 480. 7. The Peruvian Indians, it has been learned, called their god simply the Sublime, and their open-air temples were hills upon which one climbed on either of two sides by very long stairways, and all their magnificence consists in their height. Thus everywhere the magnificence of temples is measured by their disproportionate height. The pediment of temples we find in Pausanias was called Aetos, which is very much to our purpose, for it means eagle. The forests were cleared to afford a prospect for observing whence came the auspices of the eagles, who fly higher than all other birds. Perhaps for that reason the pediments were called, quote, Pinnae Templorum, which must later have prompted the term Pinnae Mororum, because on the confines of these first temples of the world the walls of the first cities were erected, as we shall see later. And finally, in architecture, what we now call the merlons of battlements were called eagles. 481. But the Hebrews worshiped the true All-Highest, who is above the heavens and the enclosure of the tabernacle. And Moses, wherever the people of God extended their conquest, gave orders that the sacred groves enclosing the lights that Tacitus speaks of should be burned. 482. From the foregoing, we gather that the first laws everywhere were the divine laws of Jove. So ancient in origin is the usage which has come down in the languages of many Christian nations of taking heaven for God. We Italians, for example, say, quote, I wish the sky, end quote, may heaven please, and, quote, I hope for the sky, quote, I hope for heaven, end quote, meaning God in both expressions. The Spanish have the same usage. The French say bleu for blue, and since blue is a term of sense perception, they must have meant by bleu the sky. And just as the Gentile nations used sky for Jove, the French must have used bleu for God in that impious oath of theirs, morbleu, God's death. And they still say parbleu, by God. And this may serve as an example of the mental dictionary proposed in the axioms, which has been discussed above. 2. 483. The need for certainty of ownership was a large part of the necessity for the invention of characters and names in the native sense of houses branching into many families, which the perfect propriety were called gentas. Thus Hermes, or Mercury Trismegistus, a poetic character of the first founders of the Egyptians, as we have shown, was their inventor of laws and letters. From this Mercury, who was likewise held to be the god of trade, the Italians, by a wonderful parallel in thought and expression lasting to our own time, took the verb mercere, to mark, in the sense of branding with letters or insignia the cattle or other merchandise they have for sale, to distinguish and identify the owners. 3. 484. Such are the first origins of family coat of arms, and hence of medals and coins. From these devices, employed first for private and later for public needs, came the learned emblems for pleasure's sake. These latter, by a sort of divination on the part of the scholars, were called heroic, but they have to be explained by mottos, for their meanings are now merely analogical, whereas the natural heroic emblems were such from lack of mottos, and spoke forth in their very minuteness. Hence they were in their own right the best emblems, for they carry their meaning in themselves. For example, 3 ears of grain, or the 3 scythe-swinging motions, naturally signify 3 ears. And so it came about that names and characters were interchangeable, and names and natures came to mean the same thing, as we have said above. 485. Now, beginning all over again with family arms, in the returned barbarian times, the nations again became mute in vulgar speech. For this reason, no notice has come down to us of the Spanish, French, Italian, or other languages of those times, and Greek and Latin were known only by the priests, so that among the French, clerk was used in the sense of a literate man, and on the other hand the Italians, as we have seen from a fine passage in Dante, used laico, layman, for a man ignorant of letters. Indeed, even among the clergy, ignorance was so dense that we read documents signed by bishops with the simple sign of the cross, because they did not know how to write their own names. And even the learned prelates could write but little, as is shown by the diligent Father Mabillon in his work De Re Diplomatica, with its copperplate facsimiles of the signatures of bishops and archbishops to the acts of the councils of those barbarous days. They can be seen to have been written with letters more misshapen and clumsy than those of the most untaught simpleton of today. Yet, for the most part, the chandlers of the realms of Europe were such prelates as was the case with the 3 chancellor archbishops of empire, on each of the German, French, and Italian. And from these, because of the way they had of writing their letters with such irregular shapes, must have come the phrase chancellor's script, Because of this scarcity of literate men, an English law was decreed according to which a criminal under sentence of death who knew his letters would be spared as excelling in art. Perhaps from this term, lettered came to later signify learned. 486. Because of the same scarcity of men who could write, we do not find a single wall in ancient houses without some device carved upon it. Moreover, the barbarous Latins applied the term terre presa to a farm with its boundaries, and the Italians called it podere, with the same idea the Latins had in calling it predium, for the lands brought under cultivation were the first booty, prey of the world. In the law of the 12 tables, estates were called mancipia, and those under real estate bond, principally to the public treasury, were called praedes or mancipes, and the so-called real servitudes were referred to as iura praedorium. The Spanish, moreover, used the word prenda for bold enterprises, because the first bold enterprises of the world were the taming and cultivation of the land, which we shall find to have been the greatest of all the labors of Hercules. Again, a coat of arms was called by the Italians an ensign, in the sense of a thing signifying, whence the Italian verb insignare, to teach. They also called it divisa, device, because the ensigns were used as signs of the first divisions of the fields, which had previously been used in common by all mankind. The originally real term, boundary posts of these fields, later became the vocal terms of the scholastics, that is, significant words serving as terms of prepositions. Among the American Indians, as we have seen above, the hieroglyphs for distinguishing their families have a similar use of terms. 487. The conclusion to be drawn from the foregoing is that in the time of mute nations, the great need answered by ensigns was that for certainty of ownership. Later they became public ensigns in times of peace, and from these were derived the medals, which with the introduction of warfare were found suitable for military insignia. The latter have their primary use as hieroglyphs, inasmuch as wars were waged, for the most part between nations differing in speech, and hence mute in relation to each other. Striking confirmation of what has been so far reasoned out is to be found in the example of the eagle on the scepter. For this symbol was used alike by the Egyptians, the Etruscans, the Romans, and the English, who still use it as an ornament of their royal arms. This by a uniformity of ideas, for all in these nations, divided though they are by immense tracts of land and sea, the symbol was meant to signify that the realms had their origins from the first divine kingdoms of Jove, by virtue of his auspices. Finally, when commerce by means of coined money was introduced, it was found that these metals were suitable for use as coins, which indeed were for that reason called monetae, from monendo by the Latins, just as insignare from the insignia among the Italians. In like fashion, from the Greek nomos came nomisma, as Aristotle tells us, and perhaps from it too came the Latin numus, which the best authorities write thus with one M. In French too, law was called loi, and the metal for coins alloy. These terms can have had no other origin than the law or right signified by the hieroglyph, which is precisely the use of metals. All of which is strikingly confirmed by the following names of coins: ducat from ducendo, which is said of captains; soldo, whence soldier; and scudo, a defensive arm, which originally meant the escutcheon, or field of family arms, which in the beginning was the tilled land of each father in the time of the families, as will be shown later. This will shed light on the many ancient metals on which we find an altar, a lituus, the augur's rod for taking the auspices as noted above, or a tripod from which the oracle spoke, as is indicated by the phrase dictum ex tripode, from the word of the oracle. 488. To this sort of metals must have belonged the wings with which the Greeks in their fables attached to all physical objects, signifying the heroic constitutions based on the auspices. Thus, Adanthrasis, among the real hieroglyphs with which he answered Darius, sent a bird, and the Roman patricians in all their heroic contest with the plebs, as clearly appears in Roman history, for the preservation of their heroic rights, maintained as law that the auspices were theirs. Similarly, in the returned barbarism, we find noble arms bearing plumed helmets, and in the West Indies only the nobles are adorned with feathers. 4. 489. The name Ius, quote-unquote Jove, when contracted just to Ius, must have meant first of all the fat of the victims owed to Jove, as we have said above. Similarly, on the returned barbarism, the term canon was applied both to ecclesiastical law and to the payment made by the fief-holder to his immediate master, perhaps because the first fiefs were introduced by the ecclesiastics, who, not being able to cultivate them themselves, gave the fields of the church to others to till. These two observations are corroborated by the two above mentioned. The Greek usage by which nomos means law, and nomisma means coin, and the French usage by which loi and aloi have the same meanings. Precisely in the same way, that was called Ius Optimus, for Jove most strong, which by the force of the thunderbolt gave a beginning to divine authority in its primary sense, which was that of ownership, as we have said above, for all things were of Jove. 490. That truth of rational metaphysics concerning the omnipresence of God, which had been taken in the false sense of poetic metaphysics, Iovis omnia plena, quote, all things are full of Jove, end quote, conferred human authority on those giants who had occupied the first empty lands of the world, in the same sense of ownership. In Roman law, this was certainly called ius optimum, but its original meaning was quite different from that in which it was used in later times. For it had at first the sense defined by Cicero in a golden passage in his Orations, quote, ownership of real estate subject to no encumbrance private or public, end quote. This ius was called optimum in the same sense of strongest, as not having been weakened by any extraneous encumbrance. For right was reckoned by strength in the first times of the world, as we shall see. This ownership must have belonged to the fathers in the family state, and was consequently the natural ownership which had to precede the civil. As cities were formed by uniting families based on this best ownership, called in the Greek dikaion ariston, they were originally aristocratic, as we shall see later. Springing from the same origin among the Latins, the so-called commonwealths of the optimates were also called commonwealths of the few, because they were made up of those few whom just Jupiter loved. In their heroic contest with the plebs, the heroes maintained their heroic constitutions by means of the divine auspices. In mute times they signified their continuations by the bird of Adenthris, by the wing of the Greek fables, and finally in the articulate language of the Roman patricians by declaring, the auspices are ours. 491. Jove, with his bolts, from which the most important auspices were drawn, had struck down the first giants and driven them under the earth to live in the caves of the mountains. By striking them down in this fashion, he had given them the opportunity of becoming lords of the fields of those lands, where they found themselves settled in hiding, and thereby they became the lords in the first commonwealths. And because of this ownership, when they approved or authorized anything, each of them was said to become its fundus, in the sense of its auctor. From the private authority within the family came, within the union of the families, as we shall see, the civil or public authority of their ruling heroic senates, as set forth in the medal, of which there are so many examples among those of the Greek commonwealths reproduced in golds, depicting 3 human thighs united in the center with the soles of the feet on the circumference. This signifies the ownership of the fields of each region or territory or district of each commonwealth. This is now called eminent domain, and is signified by the hieroglyph of the poem, which today surmounts the crown of civil powers, as will be set forth later. The fact that the legs in the medal are 3 in number lends particular strength to this interpretation, as the Greeks were accustomed to express the superlative by the number 3, as the French now say tres for very. By the same figure of speech, Jove's thunderbolt was called three-furrowed, because it furrowed the air most forcefully. Thus the idea of furrowing was perhaps first applied to air, then earth, and finally water. Similarly, Neptune's trident was so called because, as we shall see, it was a most powerful hook for biting or grappling ships, and Cerberus was called three-throated for having an enormous gullet. 492. What we have said here of family arms is to be preferred to our discussion of their origins in the first edition of this work, though that is the third passage in that edition, on whose account we do not regret its publication. 5. 493. It follows from all this that Grotius, Selden, and Pufendorf, the three princes of the natural law of nations, should have begun their expositions from the letters and laws which Hermes Trismegistus devised for the Egyptians, from the characters and names of the Greeks, and from the names which signify both gentes and laws to the Romans. And they should have gone on to unfold it by a well-informed interpretation of the hieroglyphs and fables as the metals of the times in which the Gentile nations were founded, and thus to ascertain their customs by a metaphysical criticism of the founders of the nations, which should have given the first light to the philological criticism of their writers, who did not come forth until more than 1,000 years after the nations had been founded. Chapter 7. Final Corollaries concerning the Logic of the Learned. 1. 494. The results so far reached by the aid of this poetic logic concerning the origins of languages do justice to their first creators. They were rightly regarded as sages in all subsequent times because they gave natural and proper names to things, so that, as we saw above, among the Greeks and Latins, name and nature meant the same thing. 2. 495. The first founders of humanity applied themselves to sensory topics, by which they brought together those properties or qualities or relations of individuals and species which were, so to speak, concrete, and from these created their poetic genre. 3. 496. So that we may truly say the first age of the world occupied itself with the primary operation of the human mind. 4. 497. And first it began to hew out topics, which is an art of regulating well the primary operation of our mind, by noting the commonplaces that must all be run over in order to know all there is and a thing that one desires to know well, that is, completely. 5. 498. Providence gave good guidance to human affairs when it aroused human minds first to topics rather than to criticism, for acquaintance with things must come before judgment of them. Topics has the function of making minds inventive, as criticism has that of making them exact. And in those first times all things necessary to human life had to be invented, and invention is the property of genius. In fact, whoever gives the matter some thought will observe that not only the necessaries of life, but the useful, comfortable, pleasing, and even luxurious and superfluous had already been invented in Greece before the advent of the philosophers, as we shall show later when we speak of the age of Homer. On this point we have set forth an axiom above, namely that children are extraordinarily gifted in imitation, that poetry is nothing but imitation, and that the arts are only imitations of nature, and consequently, in a certain sense, real poetry. Thus, the first peoples, who were the children of the human race, founded first the world of the arts. Then the philosophers, who came a long time afterwards, and so may be regarded as the old men of the nations, founded the world of the sciences, thereby making humanity complete. 6. 499. The history of human ideas is strikingly confirmed by the history of philosophy itself. For the first kind of crude philosophy used by men was autopsia, or the evidence of the senses. It was later made use of by Epicurus, for he, as a philosopher of the senses, was satisfied with the mere exhibition of things to the evidence of the senses. And the senses of the first poetic nations were extremely lively, as we have seen in our account of the origins of poetry. Then came Aesop, or the moral philosophers whom we should call vulgar. As we have noted above, Aesop preceded the 7 sages of Greece. Aesop taught by example, and since he lived in what was still the poetic age, he took his examples from fictitious similitudes. The good Menenius Agrippa used one such to reduce the rebellious Roman plebs to obedience. An example of this sort, or better still, a true one, is even now more persuasive to the ignorant crowd than the most impeccable reasoning from maxims. After Aesop came Socrates, who introduced dialectic, employing induction of several certain things related to the doubtful thing in question. Before Socrates, medicine, by induction of observations, had given us Hippocrates, prince of all the doctors, both in merit and precedence, who earned the immortal eulogy, "He deceives no one, nor is deceived by any." Mathematics, by the intuitive, inductive method called synthetic, had made in Plato's time its greatest progress in the Italian school of Pythagoras, as we can see from the Timaeus. Thus, by virtue of this unitive method, Athens at the time of Socrates and Plato was resplendent in all the arts for which human genius can be admired: poetry, eloquence, and history, as well as music, casting in bronze, painting, sculpture, and architecture. Then came Aristotle and Zeno. The former taught the syllogism, a method which displays the universals in their particulars, rather than putting together the particulars to form universals. The latter taught sorites, which, like the method of modern philosophers, makes mind subtle but not sharp. Neither of them yielded anything else of note to the advance of the human race. Hence, with great reason, Bacon, great alike as philosopher and statesman, proposes, commends, and illustrates the inductive method in his Novum Organum, and is still followed by the English with great profit in experimental philosophy. 7. 500. This history of human ideas clearly convicts of their common error all those who, under the influence of the mistaken popular belief and the superlative wisdom of the ancients, have held that Minos, the first lawgiver of the Gentile nations, Theseus at Athens, Lycurgus at Sparta, and Romulus and other kings at Rome, established universal laws. For the most ancient laws, we observe, were conceived as commanding or forbidding one individual alone. Only later were they given general application, so incapable of universals were the first peoples. And furthermore, they were not conceived at all before the acts occurred that made them necessary. The law of Tullus Hostilius in the case against Horatius is nothing else but the penalty decreed by the duumvirs, appointed for that purpose by the king against the illustrious culprit. Livy calls it lex horrendi carminis. It is one of the laws which Draco wrote in blood, and sacred history calls them leges sanguinis. Livy's observation that the king did not wish to proclaim the law in order not to be responsible for such a harsh and unpopular verdict is quite ridiculous. For the king himself prescribed the formula of condemnation to the duumvirs, so that the latter could not have absolved Horatius, even had they found him innocent. Livy is here not at all clear, for he did not understand that in the heroic senates, which were aristocratic as we shall see, the kings had no other power than that of creating duumvirs, to act as commissioners to adjudicate public suits, and that the peoples of the heroic cities consisted of nobles only, to whom the condemned could appeal. 501. To return now to the point, that law of Tullus is in fact one of the so-called examples, in the sense of exemplary punishments, which must have been the first examples used by human reason. This agrees with what we learned from Aristotle above in the Axioms, that, quote, in the heroic commonwealths there were no laws concerning private wrongs or injuries, end quote. Thus first came real examples, and later the reasoned ones of logic and rhetoric. But when intelligible universals had come to be understood, that essential property of law, that it must be universal, was recognized, and the maxim of jurisprudence was established that we must judge by the laws, not by examples. This is the end of Chapter 7, and also the end of Section 3 from Book 2 of The New Science by Giambattista Vico. In the next video, we will proceed to Section 4, entitled Poetic Economy. Thank you for listening.